I'm Professor Darren Hutchinson, and my colleagues Terry Smith and Gregory Parks will join me in discussing the Trump administration's social movements, race, and a lot of other issues. We're each going to speak for about 15 minutes so that we can have some robust Q&A. And Gregory is going to start off the presentation, and we'll all introduce ourselves and tell you a little bit about us. All right, so without further delay, Gregory.
Let's see. First, I want to thank Brooklyn Law School for hosting this. Whenever I think of the word or name Brooklyn, I always think of Biggie Smalls, where Brooklyn at? I want to thank the conveners. I want to thank Ben Capers for the correspondence and helping coordinate this panel. I want to thank Darren Hutchinson and Terry Smith for inviting me. Now, it was my understanding that the title of this panel was supposed to be Three the Hard Way, 1970s blaxploitation film. But I prefer to think of us as the 1980s hip-hop group from Philadelphia, 3 Times Dope. And this all fits with a theme, because now that we're here in the great state of New York, my home state, the best threesome hip-hop trilogy would be Run DMC, though from Queens. And in all seriousness, I want to frame this, my remarks, vis-a-vis a paper I've been working on for about a year titled How Much a Dollar Cost. And what the paper attempts to do, the article attempts to do, is something similar to what Caleb Mason did with a law review article he wrote based on verse 2 of Jay-Z's 99 Problems, a song, looking at it through the lens of the Fourth Amendment search and seizure. And this article that I'd been working on wanted to contemplate how the intersection of religiosity and political ideology paradoxically predicts attitudes towards the poor, and therefore its impact on public policy vis-a-vis the poor. My thesis is while political conservatives tend to have higher levels of religiosity than political liberals, conservatives also paradoxically have harsher views about the poor and thus embrace socioeconomic hierarchies. This has implications for public policy with respect to the poor. Now, just as a little background, Kendrick Lamar's song, How Much a Dollar Costs, is a song that is a true story about his interaction with a panhandler in South Africa. And the story in the song reflects his attitudes of anger, frustration, stereotyping, and rejection of the panhandler with the role of faith and religion in the background. So as I go through this, it's a little bit of an odd presentation because I'm actually talking about and also I'm a social scientist, so much of this is based on empirical research. There's a little bit of law at the end, but there's mostly social science and some sort of biblical passages here and there because I think that they lay out some important stories, and I'm not trying to proselytize, just so you know. But I'm walking through lyrics of a song. So I'll go through it just in case you can't see it. So the first verse is, how much a dollar really costs? The question is detrimental, paralyzing my thoughts. Parasites in my stomach keep me with a gut feeling, y'all. Gotta see how I'm chilling once I park this luxury car. Hopping out feeling like big as Matumbo. 20 on pump 6, Dirty Marcellus called me Dumbo. 20 years ago, can't forget. Now I can lend all my ear or to how to stack these residuals tenfold, the liberal concept of what men'll do. 20 on 6, he didn't hear me. Indigenous African only spoke Zulu. My American tongue was slurring. Walked out of the gas station, a homeless man with a semi-tan complexion. Asked me for 10 rand, stressing about dry land. Deep water, powder blue skies that crack open. a piece of crack that he wanted. I knew he was smoking. He begged and pleaded, asked me to feed him twice. I didn't believe it, told him beat it. Contributing money just for his pipe, I couldn't see it. He said, my son, temptation is one thing that I've defeated. Listen to me, I want a single bill from you, nothing less, nothing more. I told him I ain't have it and closed my door. Tell me how much $1 costs. It's more to feed your mind, water, sun, and love, the one you love, all you need, the air you breathe. Now, in the article, I analyze every line, and in this 15 minutes, I'm not going to analyze every line. I'm going to lay out certain portions that I think raise important points that I think we need to think of. So lines 1 through 3, the real question is, what is the true cost of money? Not simply what does it buy, but also what is the loss or penalty incurred, especially in gaining money. So if we look to the Bible, as evangelicals would do, no servant, the Bible tells us no servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Interestingly, lines 13 through 21 tell us something about stereotyping and how people generally stereotype the poor and the extent to which they stereotype the poor. So social psychologists will tell you that a stereotype is a generalized judgment about an individual based on his or her membership in a particular social group. Research generally tells us that poor strangers receive significantly lower overall ratings than wealthy strangers. There's some debate in the research literature about the extent to which the poor are stereotyped as being alcohol or drug users above and beyond wealthy individuals. Some research suggests the poor are not necessarily stereotyped as being higher level alcohol or drug users than the wealthy. But there is research on this thing called the culture of poverty, which suggests that the poor are stereotyped as alcohol and drug abusers more so than the wealthy. Then we come to lines 27 through 29. We get back to the question of how much $1 costs. The book of Matthew tells us, then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you as a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. So it raises questions about individuals, whatever your political ideology is. If you are not willing to do something for the least of these, can you say that you truly have faith? And that's a question we have to ask to evangelicals. I'll get to this point later on, who voted for Donald Trump in high numbers. So then we get to the second verse, and it tells us, he's staring at me in disbelief. My temper is building. He's staring at me. I grab my key. He's staring at me. I started the car, then I tried to leave. And something told me to keep it in park until I could see the reason why he was mad at a stranger, like I was supposed to save him, like I'm the reason he's homeless and asking me for a favor. He's staring at me. His eyes followed me with no laser. He's staring at me. I noticed that his stare was contagious, because now I'm staring back at him, feeling some type of disrespect. If I could throw a bat at him, I'd be aiming at his neck. I never understood someone begging for goods, asking for handouts, taking it if they could. And this particular person just had it down pat, staring at me for the longest until they finally asked, have you opened up Exodus 14? A humble man is all that we ever need. Tell me how much $1 costs. So in the song, interestingly, Kendrick Lamar never talks about political ideology, but this is all inferred, and it makes for, I think, a good law review article. But the question here is, what is the relationship between perceptions of status and hostility and aggression towards individuals? So there are like two lines of research that demonstrate that individuals, when placed in a context in which they could become frustrated, they become more frustrated and hostile and aggressive towards individuals or entities that they think are lower status than higher status. So a number of studies have looked at how individuals respond to a car not taking off from a green light. fast enough or driving down a highway too slowly. Individuals tend to honk at or drive around vehicles that they perceive as lower status than vis-a-vis vehicles that they see as higher status. And then there's research that shows that there was a computerized task, and after a certain number of iterations, the computer would design, the program was designed to crash. And before it crashed, the computer screen subliminally showed either a white face or a black face. Individuals subliminally primed with black face showed more frustration than individuals primed with the white face, right? So the question here is, why might individuals become more hostile and frustrated towards individuals that they perceive as of lower socioeconomic status? And then lines 41 through 43 asks questions about, what do we think is the root of poverty, right? Do we think it's about something wrong with the individual, or do we think it's something wrong with society? So we know that cognitive responses are a product of positive or negative inherent beliefs about a particular group. Attribution theory tells us that individuals accredit actions to their dispositional or situational causes. Groups that advocate dispositional causes tend to withhold help from individuals. Those advocating situational causes desire to provide support. Attributions for poverty predict attitudes towards policies directed at aiding the poor, and conservatives have strong beliefs about a just world, blame poverty on dispositional causes that provoke anger and refusal to help. Liberals are just the opposite. All right, so last verse, I won't read it. I'll raise a couple of points because I have 5 minutes, as opposed to 6 minutes Dougie Fresher on, for those young folks who are hip-hop heads in here. All right, so one of the things that we know is that conservatives tend to have higher levels of religious attitudes than liberals. You would think that that would make them more giving towards the poor, but it's a bit of a mixed bag and not necessarily true that that's the case. One thing we know from research is that conservatives tend to give money when they give of themselves. Liberals tend to give time, but where individuals are high in religiosity, they're less likely to give for non-religious reasons, at least with respect to conservatives. American evangelicals endorse accountable individualism, which is a moral accountability for one's own actions. And at least in the United States, it intersects with a certain level of national identity, and together they predict a certain level of economic conservatism, right? And an expectation that the poor lift themselves up by their bootstraps. So you have this dynamic, right? You have conservatives who tend to be higher on levels of religiosity. People who tend to be more religious, you would think that they give more to the poor, more understanding about the plight of the poor, but it seems to be just the opposite, that conservatives actually have more hostile attitudes towards the poor than the liberals, and this seems like it predicts their attitudes towards public policy. Bless you. So I'll skip this. We can talk about it in a minute. So really, at the end of the day, the question is, how much does a dollar cost? I think this is an interesting verse from the book of Matthew. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." And the question is, do evangelicals, do supporters of Donald Trump sort of view the poor this way? Now, the Pope, I think, probably doesn't think so. Donald Trump certainly does. Now, a few things that we know. One is that in September of 2015, 60% of white evangelical voters held an unfavorable view of Donald Trump. In December of 2016, 53% had a favorable view of him. What drove their support of him? Fear about the direction of the country, LGBTQ rights, immigrants potentially taking their jobs, economic progress. Many of them actually thought that the economy was pretty bad. Religious liberty, that they were losing their own religious liberty. And interestingly, evangelicals were more likely to be part of the working class. And 81% voted for Donald Trump. Now, a few things that we know about Trump's proposed policies and their potential impact on the poor, and for those of you who've attended other sessions yesterday and today, some of these things have been gone over. One is with respect to his general budget. It would eliminate programs that help job placement and on-the-job training for individuals who are 55 years and older. It would eliminate federal agencies charged with spurring the development of deprived areas of the United States. With regard to health care, at least by way of example, the repeal of the AHCA would undermine Medicaid expansion. Interestingly, that would harm white working class individuals. Housing, it would slash HUD funding by $6.2 billion and undermine grants to low-income people to buy and rehabilitate houses. Immigration, in part, would focus on those relying on food stamps, housing assistance, or Medicaid. The law and order approach, we know, escalates mass incarceration and raises poverty rates in those communities that are most devastated. They would eliminate legal services, so on and so forth. Trump's policies, though ironically seemingly supported by the white evangelicals, is, at least according to Kendrick Lamar, inconsistent with the doctrine of Christianity, and it would be devastating to the poor. And as Kendrick Lamar would say in his most recent album, in light of these facts, damn.
So you'll get a bit of a generational juxtaposition here because I've never listened to Kendrick Lamar, but I will tell you that for my 53rd birthday, I saw 2 concerts. One was Hall & Oates and Tears for Fears. I take it that and the other was Babyface and Brandy. But Kendrick Lamar sounds good. So my current research project involves a rather daunting task. It's the task of applying anti-discrimination law, specifically Title VII, to demonstrate that we can infer discriminatory intent from the collective decision-making of white voters in the 2016 presidential contest and in other contests. And so that's the narrower proposition that I'm gonna trouble you with today. But there's a broader backdrop, and to that end, I invite you to embrace, reject, critique the following propositions that foreground my attempt to apply Title VII to white voting behavior. First, in a democracy, there are certain behaviors and outcomes that are so inconsistent with democratic norms that they are simply illegitimate. And to that end, one might say that this past election is illegitimate. Among the behaviors and outcomes that are inherently verboten are electoral victories that are secured by appeals to racism. If you think about all of the areas of private conduct in which we, the polity, enforce anti-discrimination norms. We don't allow discrimination in employment decisions. We don't allow discrimination in the decision, the very personal decision of to whom to rent or sell your property to. We don't allow discrimination in decisions about with whom to enter other types of contracts, 42 U.S.C. Section 1981. So we regulate private conduct heavily and enforce this anti-discrimination norm in private conduct heavily. There's no reason, voting is a private act in theory, there's no reason why we shouldn't have and why there isn't at least an implicit anti-discrimination norm in voting. Think about also the the public deliberative settings in which we enforce anti-discrimination norms. The Supreme Court recently held that a juror's invocation of racial stereotype in jury deliberations may taint and invalidate a jury verdict. Prosecutors, of course, cannot base preemptory strikes on race in legislators, and this is the recent North Carolina decision in which Justice Thomas gave us a surprise vote. Legislators acting as a collective body cannot draw congressional districts based on race, absent compelling justification. So in all of these areas of public deliberation, we have a very strong anti-discrimination norm, and of course voting is the consummate form of public collective deliberation. And so there's no reason to suppose we don't have at least an implicit anti-discrimination norm in voting. And perhaps more to the point, those of you who are familiar with Bush v. Gore, since there's no right to vote in a presidential election at all, there's certainly no right to vote on a discriminatory basis. One point of doctrinal clarification for those of you who are thinking about the Voting Rights Act and are familiar with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and you may be asking yourself, well, why can't I get to what I want to get to using the 1965 Voting Rights Act? And the short answer is that the Voting Rights Act treats state action as action by the state or a political subdivision. It actually doesn't treat discriminatory decisions by groups of voters as a form of state action, although those decisions, racial bloc voting, might interact with positive law to produce results that the Voting Rights Act makes illegal, but the collective action of voters itself is not treated as a form of state action under the 1965 Act. My analysis treats individual voting decisions and the collection of those voting decisions has a form of state action that can be, should be, and is in fact regulated by anti-discrimination norms. So if my premise that anti-discrimination norms apply to the private act of voting is at all plausible to you, and I admit it may not be, and based upon your expressions, it's not, but I'm going to proceed anyway. But if it's at all plausible, then it should make sense to you why I want to apply Title VII and other types of anti-discrimination law that we typically apply to individual actions to the collective process of voting. The other reason it makes sense to apply Title VII law to voting is because, in a very real sense, it is a collective employment decision by the polity. You know, and if white voters had to explain to a reasonable juror the preference of Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, liability would be instantaneous, right? Because on paper, there's no rational reason to prefer Trump over Clinton. So there's one other premise that I want to explain to you before I actually apply Title VII law or attempt to apply Title VII law to white voting behavior in the 2016 election. There are different constructs of discrimination, such as implicit bias. Courts, as you well know, have been slow to recognize the modern and sophisticated constructs that more realistically capture how and why discrimination is perpetrated today. Given that, you might find it a bit egg-headed on my part to offer yet another construct for courts to reject, but I'm going to do precisely that. It's fairly well understood by courts since Brown versus Board of Education that discrimination has deleterious effects on its targets or subjects. What is less well understood by courts and really not interrogated by courts that much, and frankly not by legal scholars either, is the effects of discrimination on its host. So clinical psychologists, and we have a psychologist on the panel, so he will rebut this, but clinical psychologists have stepped into this void to suggest that privilege has addictive qualities, and that those who benefit from white privilege often demonstrate classical pathologies associated with addiction, such as frustration, aggression, displacement behavior, and ego defense that whites engage in order to scapegoat their problems on people of color, and often in order to avoid dealing with their own personal deficiencies. We saw this in the 2016 election with the discussion of globalization. Now, everybody's hurt to some degree by globalization, white people, black people, but of course, whites have always embraced globalization, the first form of globalization being colonization. So it's a very odd rejection of globalization by whites who have historically benefited from it. But the premise of the globalization discussion by working class whites, and the discussion has directed at them as an appeal by Trump, that somehow if you can protect the borders, if you can build walls and prevent this unfair trade, that you, working class white people, would be so much better off. But of course, that ignores the fact that the period of time during which working class white people enjoyed middle class status, only having a high school degree, was also a period of time in which there was not robust enforcement of civil rights laws, if there were civil rights laws at all. So they didn't have to compete against women. They didn't have to compete against minorities. So the supposition that but for globalization we would be so much better off presupposes that we're superior to the blacks and the Latinos and the women that we would have to compete with anew, whether or not we had globalization. So it's this kind of ego defense, these kind of ratiocinations that upon close examination you cannot withstand sunlight, that are examples of the pathologies of addictive white privilege. So there's an article that I published called White Backlash in a Brown Country that delves into white privilege as an addiction more deeply. So let me commend that to you. But for today's purposes, this alternative construct of discrimination facilitates my application of anti-discrimination law to individual voting decisions by shifting the focus not just to, and focusing not merely on the effects of discrimination on its objects or subjects, but also looking at the effects of discrimination on its host. And by doing that, we can easily see that it makes no sense for anti-discrimination law to attribute to whites this preternatural ability to abide anti-discrimination laws dictates any more than it would make sense for us to assume that an alcoholic or a drug addict would not relapse to his old ways. Privilege is addictive. If you think about the world of things that are addictive: sugar, sex, drugs, alcohol. So if all of those things are addictive, well, imagine what a culture and a lifetime and generations of white privilege do to one's psyche. Now, with all of that, and with a few minutes remaining, that has the backdrop, I want to talk about and try to apply some precepts of Title VII to individual voting decisions by white voters, and also to the collective decision of white voters who voted something to the tune of 65% in favor of Trump, or in excess of 60% in favor of Trump, and nearly 36% for Hillary Clinton. there are two basic types of disparate treatment discrimination. As many of you well know, there's pretext and there's mixed motive. Professor Parks, when he discusses the disconnect between the religiosity of these white voters and their treatment of the poor, one might describe that disconnect as simply a form of pretext. That is, people use religiosity as a Trojan horse for other things. They use their religiosity to protect their true reasons for voting the way they vote from critical scrutiny. And so one might then take this concept of pretext under Title VII, and it obviously exists in other areas of anti-discrimination law, but let's just stick with Title VII in the few minutes that I've got remaining. We might take this notion of pretext and say that, well, wait a minute, if you've cast a vote that is inconsistent with your stated reasons for why you're voting for someone, if you've cast a vote that is inherently irrational and therefore not worthy of credence, which is the definition of pretext in the Reeves versus Sanders Plumbing case from the Supreme Court, why wouldn't we look at individual white voters' decision-making through this lens and to say, well, you say that you want to cut the deficit, but you've just voted for someone whose tax plan adds $10 trillion to the deficit. That can't be the real reason. Now, of course, with any pretext analysis under Title VII, you've got to show that the false reason, that the profit reason is one that's being offered for a cover up of discrimination. So you've got to show that ultimately we've got to be able to infer that the real reason or the reason that you're hiding is a discriminatory one. And I think that we can do that in the context of the 2016 election. I would describe the 2016 presidential contest as being the most racialized contest in the past 70 years. So you'd have to go back to pre-FDR to find a more racialized contest. But I might also describe it as the most racialized contest in history. And here's why I say that. So we have these notions like dog whistle politics and implicit bias, et cetera, that address appeals to race that are shaded or subtle. There was nothing subtle in this contest. It was the resuscitation of classical forms of racism. When you open your campaign calling Mexicans whatever he called Mexicans, and you then proceed to announce a ban on Muslims and sprinkle in between all of the other racial miasma, that has overt, has Goldwater, that is just about as overt as Strom Thurmond when he ran as an independent in the 30s. It's a pretty racialized appeal, an uncommonly racialized appeal. But the other part of that is the way Hillary Clinton responded. Here's how we know that this was one of the most racialized elections in history. Never before in the history of elections has a candidate stood on stage and called another a racist. She did that. Never before in the history of elections has a candidate stood on stage and recognized that there is such a thing as implicit bias. She did that. I don't like Hillary Clinton. I didn't want her to get the nomination. But for people who criticize Hillary Clinton as being someone that minorities couldn't trust or support, she did what Barack Obama didn't do. She did what no other candidate in the history of elections did. She called her opponent. Johnson didn't do this to Goldwater. She called her opponent a racist. This was a highly racialized election. So within context then, once we start using the pretext construct of Title VII to debunk the proffered explanations of white voters, of white Trump voters, given the basic racial stimuli that define the discourse in this election, a reasonable juror could logically conclude that the real reason you voted the way you voted was because of race, to use the language of Title VII. Do I have another minute? Am I done?
Take it.
Take it, okay, thank you, thank you. Suppose you disagree with me on that. Suppose that just doesn't fly. Well, the other construct that we use under Title VII and individual disparate treatment claims is mixed motive. And under mixed motive, I just have to show that race or an impermissible characteristic was a motivating factor. I don't have to disprove as pretextual the explanations that you, as white voters, offered. This is that it was a factor. Many practitioners view that as an easier standard. You would, again, have to suspend disbelief and reimagine this election. Reimagine Trump as not saying the things that he said. Reimagine Hillary Clinton as not responding in the way, using race and using the term racist as she did, to say that race was not at least a motivating factor in the decision of millions of white Trump voters. That all leaves the question of, what do you do about it? Now, under Title VII, we know what the remedies are. In this context, we have a meta question that's much more difficult and complicated to answer. But let me close by suggesting this to you. When you are elected in an illegitimate way under illegitimate circumstances, and your presidency can credibly be called illegitimate, that has to have some consequences for governance, and that has to have some consequences for the legitimacy of what flows from your administration. Thank you.
Hello. I guess like my co-panelists, I'll start with a musical reference. I'm more of a disco, 80s house, 90s house person, and that cannot be captured on a screen. Anyway, what motivated me to organize this panel was Trump's election, and a lot of the rhetoric among the left and political pundits after he won, and that rhetoric to me tried to wash race out of the equation. So there's been a lot of discussion about economic anxiety among whites and how that is what caused them to vote for Donald Trump. And based on that assumption, there have been a lot of proposals and strategies that say the Democratic Party needs to go back to this storied past where all they did is focus on economic inequality, and then therefore the Democrats can win elections. One, I think the discussion of history in the Democratic Party is very distorted and romanticized, number one. But two, I also believe that the desire or the rush to erase race from this election is, one, belies all the empirical evidence that we've been able to accumulate after the election, and also it also is a part of this American story that tries to supplant racial narratives or narratives of racism in the face of very stark and brutal racial inequality. So that's the motivation for my paper, and in order to unpack all of this stuff, I'm going to turn to critical race theory. I think critical race theory can provide a lot of useful frameworks for thinking about not only how Trump won, but also the dangers of his policies and strategies that progressives need to consider in order to respond to those policies. So first, I just want to give a little bit of a summary of critical race theory. I know a lot of you are familiar with it. Some of you might not be familiar with it. And then after that, I'll go into employing critical race theory to think about the election, to think about Trump's policies, and to think about strategies for resistance. All right, so critical race theory started in the 1980s. A group of legal scholars, Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, Jerome Culp, Mari Matsuda, and many others, began to challenge the legal construction of race and discourse surrounding race in the legal academy. The introduction to the key writings that formed the movement, which is an anthology of very early critical race scholarship, provides a good synopsis of what inspired these early crits. Critical race theorists sought to add a racial dimension to progressive legal scholarship, such as critical legal studies movement, and also wanted to bring a progressive turn to existing civil rights scholarship that talked about race but didn't really go deeply into deconstructing how legal norms such as colorblindness, the intent rule, process theory, et cetera, contributed to the reinforcement of racial inequality. In addition to these two themes, critical race theorists developed the concept of intersectionality, which is a broader theme of this conference. Initially, the focus of critical race feminist literature, intersectionality posits that in order to provide a full accounting of subordination, scholars must resist separating systems of domination into distinct buckets, in which, for example, racism and sexism do not connect to shape the experiences of women and persons of color, particularly women of color. Intersectionality theorists also demonstrated that identity itself is multi-layered, racial identity is gendered, women's identity is raced. In my own work, I sought to expand intersectionality beyond just looking at race and to also look at class and sexuality. I also sought to emphasize the multidimensional nature of everyone's experiences, not just people who suffer from intersecting oppressions like women of color. Multidimensionality or intersectionality could, in fact, complicate the notions of intersecting privilege and subordination. Black men, for example, who are often posited in intersectionality as being privileged by maleness and subordinate due to racism, if we think about identity as being multidimensional for everyone, we can sort of complicate that notion. In my own work, I've discussed how sex for black men is a stigmatizing characteristic, and that has a long history around it, dating back to things like lynching, and we see it today with police violence and mass incarceration. So the notion that black men are physically threatening, they're dangerous, et cetera, that's an intersectional concept. That's the intersection of blackness and maleness, and I think it's important to examine subordination and using that lens for all subordinate groups, not just for people who sit at the axes of two different types of forms of discrimination. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn to Trump's victory, because I think that if we talk about multi-layered identity and we talk about intersecting subordination, we can really complicate the notion that race was secondary to his victory. All right, I agree with my co-panelists that race was a central aspect of Trump's, not only his campaign, but also his victory. By contrast, many progressives have said that the reason why Hillary Clinton lost was because the Democrats have abandoned the working class. All right, and so there's been People from Bernie Sanders to Biden to Elizabeth Warren have said the Democrats need to return to the working class, and and also to abandon identity politics, which has this ring of let's get beyond talking about racial discrimination or sexism and discrimination against the disabled and focus on working class issues, as if all of these things are neatly separable. All right, before I begin to unpack that particular criticism, the abandonment of the working class, I just want to cabin that, yes, I agree with a lot of the arguments that Democrats need to be more progressive, or that I would like to imagine a world where progressive politics won at the national level and the local level. All right, I like to tell people who ask me, well, what do you want to see out of a president, or what do you want to see in the country? If I could write a script for how the world would look, it would look very different, okay? It would be a work of fiction, okay? But it would be very left, all right, extraordinarily left. But I don't live in a fictionalized world, all right? There are things that, we live in a shared space. We share space with racism, we share space with corporate power, we share space with sexism and all these other things which constrain what we can do. Having said that, I do believe that there were alternatives, all right? There are alternatives between the two parties that, as complicated as the Democrats were in terms of a class agenda that would help poor and working class people, the Democrats presented a better agenda, all right? So why the rhetoric about the working class being abandoned by the Democrats and that causing the election to go for Trump? Well, that rhetoric works only when you erase people of color, right? It works when you erase people of color. Why? If you look at exit polls and data about how people voted, you'll see some interesting patterns. One, Hillary Clinton won poor voters. So the poorest people voted for Hillary Clinton. Some of that is because younger people voted for Hillary. So people have no income, people who are in college, people who just graduated from college perhaps, they voted for Hillary Clinton. All right, people of color who have lower income overall than whites voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton and not for Donald Trump. All right, so if you start thinking about race and class together, or age and class together, you have a very different picture than the working class preferred Trump. The word that's missing, there's an adjective missing when we talk about the working class voting for Trump, and it's white. White working class voted for Trump overwhelmingly, just like all white voters. All right, he won every income bracket among whites. And that's basically been the case since 1964, but it actually started earlier than that, all right? People use 1964 as this legendary date because no Democrat has won a majority, no Democratic presidential candidate has won a majority of white voters nationally since 1964, but actually the departure of whites from the Democratic Party started in the 50s when Truman went more progressive on civil rights than FDR had done. All right, so that migration started a bit earlier, but since 1964, Democrats just have not won a majority of whites nationally, and a lot of that has to do with regional politics. In the South, the former Confederacy, whites left the Democratic Party, and it's now largely a red territory. All right, so if we have a situation where poor people of color voted for Clinton, not Trump, poor and wealthy whites voted for Trump, Clinton won the poorest voters, Trump won the wealthiest voters, what role, if any, did economics play? All right, and so with that, I want to turn to the economic anxiety discussion. All right, so there's so much discourse around economic anxiety. Trump played on whites' fears of the economy, and particularly this resonated, according to the political analysis, with people who lived in the Rust Belt, where industrialization has flattened, jobs have left the country, they are now in Asia. They're also now done by robots. So there's all this narrative that Trump was able to capitalize on that economic anxiety among whites in order to win. Well, the notion that economic anxiety supplants race is horribly complicated, all right? And it's undermined by this whole concept of intersectionality. Economic anxiety and racism have a long legacy of existing together, right? The South seceded from the United States because they were afraid of abolition and what it would do to their economy. Chinese exclusion was about economic anxiety. Jim Crow was about economic anxiety. Vincent Chin was beaten up because of economic anxiety. All of this stuff, we have a long history of whites' fears of their economic well-being or their desire to preserve economic privilege, having a very racist and sexist dimension to it. And Trump was able to capitalize on that. So I agree that there are a lot of whites who were experiencing economic anxiety, but the way they channeled that, unlike persons of color, was to run to racism. All right, and so the way they ran to racism was by embracing the wall, right, and embracing a ban on Muslims, and embracing xenophobia generally, embracing rhetoric that portrayed the social welfare state as something that privileges lazy minorities over hardworking whites. And the interesting thing is working class rhetoric that we see on the left since the election talks about, you know, these individuals. One of the lines in this analysis is that these individuals are hard-working Americans. They are not racist, and we can't just say that they voted out of race. It's a very interesting narrative because what it isn't looking at is the hardworking poor people who weren't racist and who voted against racism. All right, so if we use this intersectional lens, we can look at the economic story in a way that does not supplant race. In fact, race is a central component of that economic story. All right, one other, and this is just a tidbit as I'm running out of time, one other thing to think about when you hear the working class story is a lot of times when pollsters are talking about working class voters, they actually mean people who don't have a college degree. All right, and for whites, not having a college degree does not necessarily mean you're poor. All right, so a lot of these working class whites have six-figure incomes, a large chunk of them. And if you look at how they voted, it was almost identical to the voting patterns of poor whites without a college degree. All right, Trump's weakest performance with whites was with whites who have a college degree, but he actually won that group as well. All right, so another complication to this working class narrative is that it's not necessarily talking about poor people, it's often just talking about people without a college degree. All right, so what about its policies and what about strategies in 60 seconds? All right, policies. I absolutely think we have to employ this lens of intersectionality to think about his policies. All right, some of the most vulnerable people are going to be impacted if he gets his way, if these policies are implemented. And I'm thinking of poor persons of color, women-headed households with children in them, elderly people who are poor. Look at all these categories together. These individuals are extremely vulnerable and reliant upon social welfare policies for protection. And his budget goes after those individuals, all right? And we really need to focus on that. Our attention needs to go to analyzing those policies and looking at the impact using this lens of intersectionality and multidimensionality. Another thing is with anti-discrimination law. All right, so Betsy DeVos, our favorite Department of Education secretary, who cannot imagine a statute that prohibits discrimination in terms of the provision of education. That's huge in and of itself. One of the things that I've been thinking about with respect to education and discrimination is that the most vulnerable children are the ones who rely the most on these anti-discrimination measures. So when you think about the education of people with disabilities, one of the things that Hillary Clinton ran on was just expanding access to education with people with disabilities versus Trump mocking disabled individuals. They're slashing civil rights enforcement in all of the agencies, including the Department of Education. All right, that's his goal, is to slash that and to step back enforcement efforts. And of course, the secretary herself cannot even imagine a statute that she would need to enforce. The most vulnerable children are the poor kids. All right, so poor young people, disabled young people, extraordinarily vulnerable in the educational setting. And when you tie that together, young, poor, and disabled, you see so many different patterns of oppression, ranging from discriminatory suspensions, expulsions, failure to provide education, all of those things. So we need to look at these policies in a very deep and complicated way. And if we pull intersectionality in there, we see that so many different axes of discrimination and subordination are implicated. Finally, what do? Well, I think we need to scrutinize this stuff in a very complex way in which I've described. Other strategies, I think a lot of people have spoken about these during the week. Politics is local and federal. We need to think locally. Prosecutors, demanding that prosecutors change the enforcement of criminal law is one way that's important in the immigration context that I'm excited to see some prosecutors saying they're considering the collateral consequences of arresting people or charging them with certain crimes and what that might do, not generally for individuals, but for people who have complicated immigration status, all right? Baltimore recently announced before they charge an undocumented person with a crime, they're going to consider whether they can do a different charge, one that's lower, in order to avoid deportation issues. All right, we need to think about voting. So Trump has created this Voting Rights Commission, or is it the Voting Non-Rights Commission? Extraordinarily huge impact on poor people of color or people of color with language issues, elderly people. Essentially, what they are trying to do is to legitimize the notion that there's voter fraud and to come up with some scheme to keep people of color from voting. We need to be extraordinarily vigilant on that particular issue. And I just want to put in one plug because I now reside in the state of Florida. Felon disenfranchisement is a huge issue in Florida. Florida disenfranchises more felons than any other state. On the ballot this November is a proposed constitutional amendment to restore voting rights once those sentences have been served. Please get involved with that. That's 3 million voters, right? Which could really shift the political terrain in Florida. And I think it can pass if there's national energy. We need some donations to help market the thing. That's one very specific way that we can do some change. And with that, I will stop, and we will have some time. How much, Bennett?
Questions? So,
Thank you.
so Terry, you recognized obviously that you were getting skeptical looks
I was joking. You're skeptical?
So I just need to start with the original premise that we sort of regulate private discrimination, because it seems to me, in fact, we tolerate quite a bit of private discrimination. So in the housing context, we sort of exempt sort of small, sort of like, you know, the Aunt Julia who has like 3 residences in her building. She can discriminate as much as she wants. I'm pretty sure we do the same thing in the employment context under Title VII for small businesses, especially family.
State law captures that, though.
And we tolerate private discrimination in terms of intimacy. So there are all these other places where we're sort of fine with private discrimination, so I'm not sure why voting isn't more like that kind of private discrimination that we already say is okay.
Because of the
And
externalities, the negative externalities. I mean, who I sleep with just doesn't have the same impact on everybody else in the community as who I vote for does. But voting is not a private decision, and you have no right to exercise. Since you don't have the right to vote to begin with, there's certainly no right to do it irrationally because of the negative externalities. So now a majority of Americans have to abide the decision of a minority of, this is on tape, so I won't use the term that comes to mind. I'll just use something that's appropriate, but of a minority of the electorate who chose a palpably unqualified candidate by every metric. So that's the difference. The negative externality. Voting is a private decision with a great deal of publicness to it.
I just want to know who's bringing the suit. Who is standing to bring the suit in this case where you're going to apply Title VII to the outcome of an
Yeah.
election?
So Title VII is the analogy. It's just it works. It's an analogy. So I don't have a remedy, and I'm not offering up a remedy. What I'm saying is that if you can claim logically and reasonably, using that analogy, that an election outcome is illegitimate, then it ought to have an effect on how we cover, how we view, whether we respect. Kathy, who's this comedian?
Kathy Griffin.
There, if he doesn't respect the presidency, and he doesn't, why should she respect the presidency, and why should she suffer any consequences for saying what she said? He suffers no consequences for all of the things that he says. So denominating something as illegitimate matters, whether or not there's a remedy.
So not really talking about coming up with some kind of theory that would result in.
If you can help me do it, if you can help me do it, I'll give you credit for it. Any suggestion you got?
So, Professor Darren, I really thought it was such an important point that we're using economic anxiety to whitewash or sanitize the real anxieties that are underlying it's such a huge point, and it's not American. So maybe I can answer. I should pose as a question: is it really American exceptionalism? Or is it something that you see across the world, across history, across countries and cultures? And is there some explanation for this recurring problem that we see across the world and across time? Some sort of evolutionary kind of anxiety, or something? I'd love to hear more about this.
Right. I mean, that's a great question. I don't think subordination is uniquely American. There may be some unique ways in which American subordination occurs, but social psychologists and sociologists and anthropologists have studied group behavior and group domination, and it pretty much exists across the world. All right, so I'm thinking in particular of social dominance theory, where every group-based society, there's group-based hierarchy, and in order to justify that hierarchy, there are all these what they call legitimizing myths that go with it. So a myth could be these certain people are criminals, they are rapists, they are terrorists. All right, we call it, those are stereotypes, but those are also myths about the way certain groups behave in society. We treat them as threats in society in order to justify domination. All right, so that's just one form of social science that could account for it. There's also implicit bias. Implicit bias has been studied outside of the U.S., many societies, and the pattern is the same. There's a preference for in-groups. All right, so people prefer others who share the same social characteristics. That preference is a lot higher for privileged classes, all right? And there's a much higher animosity among privileged classes to outgroups who are subordinate to them. All right, so we see that pattern in a lot of different societies. So I didn't mean I hope it didn't come across as that, but I actually think that if you put it in comparative perspective, it actually strengthens the argument. This is something that is just a part of human behavior. It's a part of group-based society. Whether it's evolutionary or not, I can't answer that question, but it's certainly something that's been measured across various societies.
Is there a way out, I guess, is the question, like, to borrow Professor Parks' point, is it some sort of original sinner taint through your lens, biblical lens?
Right.
With my very poor biblical skills. But is it some sort of original, or just from an evolutionary perspective, is it something like that's just baked into human sociality and group-based, or do you have a more hopeful view of
Right,
the way out?
I don't actually. Even whether or not it's a part of human evolution, I think that privilege and domination are so difficult to combat. Even if it's just it's all socially constructed, it has nothing to do with some kind of biological impulse. Getting rid of that for a number of reasons is just extraordinarily difficult. Resources, in terms of economic resources to fight it. Who has weapons? I mean, when people talk about revolution, it's a very sort of sanitized term today. No one's really going to pick up whatever arm they have and try to revolt against power structures, because the power structure has a lot of weaponry. There's this quiet violence that goes on every day called mass incarceration, which is the state very brutally locking people away, and those people are normally of subordinate classes. So yeah, I think structurally it's really hard to fight against that. So maybe I'm more of a Derek Bell type person. There's a permanence to this, but you still fight. All right, so, and you try to inform people to make better decisions and to step outside of that privilege, and that's what we do as educators. That's what social movements do, and you get some advancement in those terms. But it's very slow, and it's often fleeting. So yeah.
May I chime in for a second? So to your point about the question, is it evolutionary? So there's research on implicit bias that shows that when you subliminally flash either images of black faces or white faces before individuals and they're taking a functional MRI, that their amygdala lights up when they are subliminally primed with black faces as opposed to white faces. Now, the amygdala is one of the oldest subcortical regions of the brain. That's its function is sort of fear conditioning when you perceive something as a threat. So the belief is that seeing the other, whatever the other is, and here it's race, but maybe it can be extended to other groups. You know, thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago, an individual who sees someone who is not from their group would fear that individual. So one argument is that it's evolutionary. The second point is sort of tying Darren and Terry's points together. So Darren mentioned implicit bias. Implicit bias could mean two things. One could mean, it could mean that the person is fully unaware of the associations they're making between concepts and groups of people. The other is that they are aware, but it's just automatic, right? It happens and they realize it. To Terry's point, there's also explicit discrimination that we see in the employment context and the election context. Terry, I hope you cite me with my Florida State article from years ago.
I think I
on
do.
that point. All right, good. So one of the problems is that people fear social sanctions and other kinds of sanctions, so they don't admit that they are biased against the poor, racial minorities, women, the disabled, so on and so forth. The other thing I think you have to keep in mind is that elections are highly emotional contexts, and most people don't vote rationally. Low information voters, and most Americans are low information voters, vote largely based on their feelings, and that's a problem. And then the third point I'd make is, and Terry, you might find this helpful, is the theory called motivated reasoning, that individuals oftentimes are emotionally motivated to make a decision. And because they're emotionally motivated and not rationally motivated to make that decision, and this is subconscious, this isn't even conscious, they look for information that supports their belief, even if that information or fact is de minimis. And they reject information that would undermine their beliefs, especially if that information is overwhelming, because it creates a great deal of anxiety. And so in an election, when you have two candidates, one who is clearly, in his own words, deplorable. Oh no, Hillary said deplorable. So Donald Trump is deplorable. And the other has her own sets of issues, but is not. The people who are emotionally motivated to vote for Donald Trump cannot see the facts before their eyes because they're not looking for those facts, and those facts actually make them anxious, right? So these are sort of some other theories that I think are helpful.
Sorry. Lauren, go ahead.
Okay, this question is for Terry as well as Darren. I'm wondering if you could speak to the implications of your work in respect to efforts. You know, a lot of localities are working to broaden the electorate, for example, to open, voting to younger individuals, or to make it easier to vote, and, also in terms of felon, disenfranchisement and erasing that. How would that impact the ideas of, for example, the reasonable jury, assessing competence, and, what are your thoughts about efforts for civic education more broadly to educate the electorate? Because in many respects, juries are also very biased, and there's a lot of problems in terms of, having the average person assess competency at all. And, part of, the problem with public education, the quality going down more generally, is also just civic understanding. What are the branches of government? What does the president do? The president doesn't know what the president does.
So I'm going to make a suggestion. Keep in mind Travis's question, but we're also going to take Cynthia's question and Tony's question, and then you can think about all three questions and have 10 seconds to answer all three. So Tony?
Oh, me, Tony?
Yeah.
All right. I got my hat today. So, this was great. I wonder if there's a way to link all these things together in a kind of, like, we have to talk about Kevin, or Becky, or some other.
Was that Kevin? Did you say Kevin?
We have to talk about Kevin,
Okay.
or Becky, or some
Spacey?
other word for white people.
Oh.
Talking about white people. So, because I think a really cool thing has happened this last election cycle. Right? There's a way in which we're all conscious now, in a way people weren't allowing themselves to be before, that white people, not our friends, because that's skewed, right? Those are people who are willing to be friends with us, so they're in a kind of iffy group among white people. But white people generally aren't Americans, right? America, most people say, is a 21st century cosmopolitan type of country, right? We're supposed to be linked with countries in Western Europe and in Scandinavia. We're supposed to be like that. White Americans aren't like that. They have never been like that. They've never voted that way. The people that vote for things that would make us look like Norway or Finland or Sweden or Denmark or Iceland, that's people of color, right? We would be Scandinavian type social welfare states if it were just up to people in black barbershops to vote on it. So there might be a way in which kind of talking about that now, that there's a white minority that is like people of color, and there are people of color. And that's America. That's what's cosmopolitan. That's what's holding it down in terms of 21st century values in this country. And white people are Donald Trump, right? I remember going to school with a whole lot of people who were Donald Trump in the 1970s. Those are the ones I know through friends of friends on Facebook that are still for Donald Trump now. That's been pretty consistent. They didn't vote for Obama in 12 or 08, right? So my thought is that, like, is there a way to sort of think about all the things the three of you have presented in terms of really focusing in on white people and how different they are from Americans?
Cynthia, you get the final question.
Great. So, Darren, I just wanted to say, I think you made a really excellent point about countering the idea that maleness always equals privilege. And I was going to suggest that perhaps you focus on just that point in a paper, because being black and male conjures up notions of criminality and dangerousness, as you said. Being Muslim and male conjures up notions of being a terrorist, and being Mexican and male conjures up images of being drug dealers and gang members. So I was going to suggest that you could make this the focus of one piece, break it off as like so this is your idea again, calling it something like your new article, something like debunking the myth of male privilege when it comes to, when it comes to minority men, multidimensionality, intersectionality, and I had previously said the black male, but you could, call it whatever you want. But anyway.
You should lobby GW Law Review.
Wow. So, actually, I think I just want to respond to Cynthia because I've been given paper ideas before, but never with a title. So, I love that. And actually, some people have explored these issues, but I think you're right. Especially as we create new constructs for other men of color outside of blacks. I think it's important to write about that. And also, to the extent that we morph into other types of problems with African American males, I think it's time to re-examine this concept of intersectionality. So I think that would be a great intervention, and I will add that to my list of research. To Tony, I think what you're hitting at, there's a dimension that we've all talked about. I'm not sure if I would say it's that white voters aren't American. It's that white voters definitely vote differently in most jurisdictions. A lot of people think of blue states and they think, oh, gee, the white people in these blue states are so liberal and progressive, but actually if you break it down, in a lot of blue states, they're only blue because there are high numbers of people of color in those states. So the states in which whites almost always vote for the liberal candidates, that's New England and like Illinois. California actually has a sketchy history. So they voted for Bush once. They voted for Reagan both times. They voted for Father Bush. So they have a sketchier history. They voted for Obama both times, but it was very close. I mean, it's like 53%. So it's not like New England. So I think we need to unpack that. Yes, absolutely. There's racially polarized voting in this country, and a lot of it has to do with what the parties have come to represent. So I think that's a good point.
Can I just address this question on civic education and tie it into Greg's point about low information?
Gregory.
Oh, okay. Do you have a middle name?
Scott.
Professor Park's point about low information voters. It is true that Americans are low information voters, but it's also true that Trump voters are more low information. Now, why would that be? How can you, as a voter, say that there are fewer people insured now after Obamacare than there were before? This is basic information. So at some point, you have to conclude that the ignorance is willful. In other words, it's pretextual. On just basic things, Trump voters believe that unemployment is higher now than it was in 2008. You are not free to believe that, and you are not free to be that ignorant and participate in the polity. And just let me make the analogy. So as a juror in a criminal case, you're not free to ignore the factual record. That's a deliberative process. It's a public deliberative process. Voting is no different than that. Voting has more serious consequences, or at least as serious consequences as sending a person to jail in a jury trial, in a criminal trial. So there simply is no right to be uninformed, and literacy tests are not unconstitutional. You could implement a literacy test to bar the Trump voters from voting. You could.
So on that note,